It is believed that had it not been for the Cherokee Indians helping the first settlers through the first winter, they might not have survived. They turned to the fertile land to provide food and income to survive the harsh winters and rough terrain. Big trees provided warm cabins and houses as well as heating and cooking fuel. Cold mountain springs controlled cool areas for such things as butter and milk. These were called spring houses. But the drive and cement that helped these rugged mountain men and women together was their religion. Some of the churches still stand today. They relied on faith that things would get better, and upon death they would ascend to the streets of gold. Beautiful Cage Cove. We're at the birthplace of my mother, Nancy Tipton Wright, and it's hard to visualize that during their time they had crops in these fields down here, and as you can see, they're rich and fertile. They raised their families. They had their own school systems. A lot of things going for them. One of their main difficulties was access to this area, being remote as it was in this mountain community. Outside of the wagon roads that came into Cage Cove, there was no other transportation other than horseback to this mountain community. So later on, the pioneers was able to access the outside world by means of Little River Railroad. And needless to say, they didn't need much. They were self-sufficient. They grew their own crops, had their own school systems, stores, mills. But they needed, of course, transportation to the outside world, and this is where Little River Railroad came in. Access to this rugged mountain area followed mostly the Little River and its tributaries along trails that was limited to walking or horseback. Later roads were built, but were still limited to horse-drawn buggies or wagons. Laurel Branch. We're near the old railroad bed of what used to be Little River Railroad and Lumber Company. This was a logging operation and timbering operation that occurred around 1899 and 1900. This is my wife Janice, and we'll be your host today. as we take a little trip along the Little River Railroad.
Around 1900, the Little River Railroad was established as a lumber and logging business. At that time, around 1910 to 1912, a spur was needed to access the areas of the El Dorado and Hurricane Mountain. Originally, this part of the railway was to pass along Hesses Creek and West Miller's Cove. The angry landowners in that area did not agree with the logging business and would not sell their land or negotiate a right-of-way contract. Actually, even sabotage was threatened by some. For this reason, the Little River Railroad decided to locate this part of the railway on property they already owned. The railway not only provided service to the logging and timbering industry, it also provided transportation to those people living in remote areas of what we now call Great Smoky Mountains.
I guess that Little River watershed could be termed as the lifeline to the outside world. Indian encampments were located along these areas. In the early days, following these streams was the only way a person could travel. Laurel Branch. We mentioned earlier that Laurel Branch was to be renamed. It was renamed Davis Junction Branch from a set of Davis family that lived at the intersection here of what used to be Laurel Branch and Little River. This has significant historical value. Number one, there was a train wreck that happened just downstream from here, and we'll visit that in just a moment. The other thing was that it was a junction of the main line of railroad and a set of rails that serviced the Hurricane and El Dorado for this logging operation. The rugged terrain of the Davis Junction branch would be a challenge even today with modern equipment. But with steam-powered equipment, horses, and a lot of manual labor, a railroad bed was chiseled out of this rugged wilderness. Railroad construction and logging in the early days through these mountains was probably the most labor-intensive projects of all time. The railroad bed was dug with horse-drawn scoops, or slips as they were called. The railroad surface was then finished to final grade with manual labor using shovels, rakes, and hand tools. When rock was encountered, it had to be removed using sledgehammers and star drills. Steam-powered shovels were used, but they had a short reach and was rail-mounted, which limited their use. When the logging area was reached, these men of iron was faced with another challenge: to move the timber from the higher elevations of the mountains to the loading area along the railroad track. Standing Rock Pass. When the railroad was built through here, they looked at this rock cut. They called the engineer in, and the engineer told them, said, well, this is going to be hard to shoot with dynamite because it's standing on each other. So as you can see here, Standing Rock Pass got its name from Standing Rock. When When Little River Railroad pulled up their steel tracks to leave, they left the ties in place. These ties could not be reused. Undisturbed areas of the railroad bed still showed defined depressions of these ties. These loggers and railroad men took pride in their work. Armed with a crosscut saw and an axe, some trees were so large it took a day or two just to fall the tree. It then tested the strength of the horses pulling it out and the steam-powered equipment to load it onto rail cars. We're in an area of the Davis Junction watershed. It's called a switchback. The railroad, having to achieve our higher elevation in a short distance, engineered what we call, or what they call, the switchback. They would come in this direction, achieving higher elevation, and run the track on out the mountain, and then they would switch the tracks about here and go in this direction to achieve the final elevation of Ace Gap. So it was appropriately named the switchback. Having been reared in the mountains, my parents, William Edward and Nancy Tipton Wright, wanted to return to the mountains. They were accustomed to mountain living and knew the value and opportunities of living in the mountains. In 1956, my father, William Edward Wright, they called him Willie, acquired this property. The surveying that he had done was performed by French Gregory. A little unnamed gap back here in the mountains they had trouble identifying. So let's listen in and see just exactly what happened.
We're going to have to go back to that little gap and reset that marker. I got it wrong during the survey.
What gap is that, France?
You know back there where that dog leg is, Willie?
I'm not sure where that's at.
Over there where those fence rails are.
Oh yeah,
Fence rail gap, that's what I call it.
that's Rail Gap.
Come on, I'll show you.
Okay.
Blount County, one of the most diverse areas in the eastern United States, offered a lot of natural resources and opportunities for anyone of that time period around 1900 to live in. With Little River and its tributaries offering water power for mills and the mountains of virgin timber, fertile soil for animals and crops, this area offered something for just about anyone. These resources attracted businesses and industry. Tanning bark that was harvested for the tanning of leather at the Wallen Tannery was the one thing that brought the railroad to this area. In order to lower their cost of transportation, a logging and timbering company was contacted, and the rest is history. Little River, pretty, isn't it? It's hard to believe that they put splash dams across this river to float the logs to a little town that they called Rockford then, still exists. But later the rail took the place of those splash dams. It was cumbersome, hard to do, and it required a lot of labor. So the railroad was established along this side of the river, and we're just probably a couple of 100 feet from the intersection of Davis Branch and Little River, and this is the site of the Great Train Wreck. The railroad bed having to be wider to accommodate two sets of tracks for a switch to a spur was built mostly on field dirt. Not having anything to compact the soil with properly, this normally resulted in the train jumping the tracks. a train wreck sometimes resulted.
Many years ago, I was fortunate enough to meet an elderly man who, as a child, lived with Mr. Davis across that pasture.
There was an incident that happened between Mr. Davis and the train engineer. It occurred when one of Mr. Davis's goats was run over by the train. Now, Mr. Davis was a farmer and he raised chickens and pigs, but mainly goats. He was a gentle, hard-working, yet strong-willed man, and as a mountain man, he knew ways to handle tough situations. Now, the train engineer, he was an arrogant man and he thought nothing could stop his train. Let's look at this event as the young boy remembered it.
Why'd you stop my train?
Your train run over my goat.
You stopped a train to tell me that?
Yeah, what are you gonna do about it?
Nothing. Mr. Davis, you can't stop a big train. As far as your animals go, this is my track. Keep them off of it.
He means it, Mr. Davis.
Well, we'll see about that. There's more than one way to skin a cat.
Why'd the train quit pulling?
I dropped off 2 cars. Look, what's on the track?
It looks black.
It's grease.
That darn woolly booger's done greased up our track.
Yeah, howdy fellas, having a little trouble, are we?
After a little negotiation, the train could get up the track at the Davis Junction. Stream crossings were accomplished by using large trees for bridge timbers. These timbers were sometimes washed out by the rain-swollen streams and caused a major maintenance problem. The long and curvy log skids in this rough terrain also caused major problems because the logs would sometimes jump the rails, causing further hardships on the loggers.
Shine Hollow. It was termed Shine Hollow after my father, Willie Wright, and my uncle, Henry Tipton, found a moonshine still in operation in this hollow in 1956. The moonshine still was operated by 2 people. One of them was Woodrow Sparks, and the other was Wormy Joe Garland. Now, old Woodrow couldn't read or write, but Wormy Joe could. So my father tacked a note up on this tree telling them to move the still off of their property, or he would bring his Winchester rifle back, and if that didn't work, he'd bring the sheriff.
Hey, Wormy Joe.
Yeah.
There've been some surveyors through here. They left us a note.
Surveyors? Golly bum. This is a note from Willie Wright. Says if we don't get our butts out of here, he's gonna shoot us.
I guess we better go.
Let's get out of here.
You know, it's surprising how much cooperation you can get with a Winchester rifle. You know, that still was relocated and the whereabouts is still unknown.
Once the logging operation stopped, it left these pretty mountains with a devastated look. Clear-cutting filled the streams with sediment and trash. As you look today, nature has healed itself. The new growth of trees has returned and the streams have washed themselves clean. But the old railroad beds, impressions of railroad ties and remnants of railroad can still be seen today. Also left is a history of hard-working pioneers taming the wilderness and accomplishing great feats of man and machine.
It's hard to imagine a railroad coming through this particular area. But we're at a place called Ace Gap. Great Smoky Mountain National Park lays to my left just a few hundred feet. And on down beyond was what was called the Hurricane and El Dorado. Little River Lumber Company had a major logging operation going on in the Hurricane and El Dorado. And as they brought the logs across this gap, which was the lowest point between the two higher elevations, they would stop here and play cards before continuing on down through the Davis Junction watershed and on to Townsend where the sawmill was. So having stopped here and played cards, it got its name Ace Gap. Come on, Cody.
Smoky Mountain memories about my home in Tennessee. Yesterday keeps calling me home. Mountains rising in my soul, higher than the dreams I've known. Misty eyes, they cling to me in my Smoky Mountain memories. An old gray man with a dog asleep at his feet plays a worn out fiddle full of melodies. He smiles through his eyes, but the lines on his face hold me as close as the tunes he plays. Talking about my Smoky Mountain memories, pretty girls from Tennessee. I was such a fool to leave her all alone. Think about her in my dreams. I wonder if she thinks of me. I'll always hold her close to me in my Smoky Mountain memories. Mister, play your fiddle, please, and play some mountain memories. I've been down a lonely road, so far from home. Nothing left to hold on to. I made some plans, but they fell through. Now there's nothing left for me but my Smoky Mountain memories. Smoky Mountain memories about my home in Tennessee. Yesterday keeps calling me home. Mountains rising in my soul, higher than the dreams I've known. Misty eyes, they cling to me in my Smoky Mountain